Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Monday, January 7th today, and Mercury is about to make a square from the sign of Capricorn to Mars in Aries. So that's what we're going to talk about very briefly today. So this square is pretty common. I mean, it's not like, two outer planets squaring each other. It only happens, decades and decades apart. It's something that happens throughout the year, usually a couple of times. As Mercury travels very closely to the sun, Mars moves pretty slowly. You'll see hard aspects and sextiles and trines happening between Mercury and Mars throughout the year. They have a dynamic that's common regardless of what the type of aspect is. And then the aspect always modifies the relationship between them as well. So a square is of the nature of Mars. So you're looking at a Mercury-Mars transit that is more Mars-like right now, meaning the relation between Mercury and Mars is going to be a little bit more edgy, more confrontational, more aggressive or assertive. And that's just kind of the vibe of this particular Mercury-Mars transit. So what do you want to watch for? Well, let me bring up the chart so you can see this, and I'll illustrate it for you so you can actually see what's going on here. All right, so let's annotate this. Here's Mercury at about 3 degrees and 47 of Capricorn. There's Mars at 4 degrees, 25 of Aries. So Mercury is moving into a square in the next day or so. Mercury is the faster planet, so it's applying to Mars right now, and is in what we call the superior position, which means Mercury is exerting a little bit of dominance over Mars at the moment. What does that mean? Well, one thing that you can look for when Mercury exerts little dominance over Mars, especially from practical Capricorn, Mars is in Aries, sort of like, get a plan. You need to get organized. You're reckless. You're impulsive. This is Mercury speaking, right? Well, listen, Mars, you need to sit down and make a practical step-by-step plan. You've got great energy. You've got great enthusiasm. You're the muscle here. No one's going to deny it. But you need a legal pad. You need a legal pad and a pen, and you need to sit down and think about this a little bit more. I'll help you. So you could think about it like that. Mercury and Mars coming together bring about a kind of organizational executive quality. So I wrote down some things in my written horoscope today. I'm going to go over some of them. Mercury and Mars can represent the sharp mind and tongue, just sharpness of thought, sharpness of mind, sharpness of speech. Mental agitation, the tendency to be more easily aggravated, especially by speech, by lack of organization, or the tendency to Mercury and Mars can represent the tendency to analyze, to break apart, to decode with great precision. Mercury and Mars is like the knowledge and craft and care of a surgeon. Mercury and Mars also translate that which is complex into the simple, breaking things down. Mercury and Mars can, again, bring kind of organizational strategy, executive decision-making, and a kind of intolerance for that which isn't mature or well-planned or well thought out. That's a Mercury-Mars function, especially when Mercury's applying the pressure from superior position in Capricorn. Mercury and Mars implement ideas. Like, I've got an idea, let's do it. Mercury and Mars argue, debate, boast, and confront. You give a little bit of that mental pride with Mars in the mix. Mercury and Mars can also destroy communication or negotiation. Not probably as likely with Mercury and Capricorn, but you get that feeling of, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not doing anything. I'm not budging an inch. Look at the politics right now, for example, in the United States. Same thing. Mercury and Capricorn will help Mars and Aries to become more careful, practical, methodical, and serious. Mars and Aries will help Mercury and Capricorn to take action rather than being too calculated or reserved. Mercury and Mars may break apart a traffic jam by saying, okay, you go here, you do this, you do that, let's get it moving. Mercury and Mars can represent violence or aggressive speech. Mercury and Mars makes huge, big declarations that are well argued, but inevitably attracts argumentative responses. Mercury and Mars say, get a strategy, make a plan. and don't delay. Mercury in Capricorn and Mars in Aries bring controlled and mature complaints. If you go and present a complaint to a boss or a friend, it's well thought out. You need to say something, so it's like that. Mercury and Mars are impatient when it comes to careless actions or thoughtless or whimsical planning or thinking. Mercury and Mars in Capricorn and Aries overestimate the importance of details, will maybe act both childish and overly controlling about things. Mercury and Mars may forget the benefit of going with the flow, or the value of not having a plan or strategy, but rather remaining open to intuition or to the quiet, gentle, and inner voice of guidance. Mercury and Mars takes a knife to a coffee date, so something that looks like it should be like a nice, exciting, mature experience or a date or something like that could very easily turn into a confrontation, so be careful. Mercury and Mars insist only one way. It's a little bit of the dogma of earth and fire. They're both dry by nature and can be separatist and highly individualistic and both very stubborn. Mercury and Mars thinks about nothing but its own plan, becomes too singular in its thinking and forgets about other people's feelings. Got to be careful of that right now. Mercury and Mars in a spiritual sense can give us the illusion that spiritual life is achieved by thinking about spiritual things and philosophizing about spiritual things. Mercury and Mars can provide us mental and intellectual understanding that can aid us in spiritual development. But let's not forget that at the end of the day, most spiritual and religious experiences are not usually arrived at by thinking about things. They are about being absorbed into an experience. Deep thinking, contemplating, working through problems, learning, studying, these are things we can also get absorbed in, and sometimes we can have spiritual and religious experiences from those things. So I'm not trying to hate on the mind. But a lot of the times what it boils down to is, are we thinking a lot about spiritual life, or do we have spiritual experiences on the regular? Mercury and Mars can sometimes mistakenly guide us into thinking that if I just talk and think and argue and debate a lot about spiritual things, if I repeat to myself a lot of spiritual ideas, that makes me a spiritual person. But usually spiritual life requires daily devotion from the heart, practice from the heart, and absorption of the mind into an object of devotion and love. So remember that, because that's an important lesson right now for Mercury and Mars. So that's what I've got for you on Mercury and Mars for today. I'm going to take a few Q&As that I have. Some of these are pretty simple. Kate wants to know if there are she says, I've been wondering for a long time what astrological influences could be considered as being part of shaping such a profoundly unique time period as the 1960s. Would love to hear any insights you might have on it. Yeah, so it was definitely a unique time period. There was a Pluto-Uranus conjunction in Virgo during the 1960s, which speaks to the youth. Virgo is a youthful sign, a maiden sign, a pure and a sign of the Virgin. Now, the Virgin is not just about sex, obviously. Virginal goddesses are about, in some ways, the youthful spirit that remains unattached from worldly concerns in the valley of life. Goddesses are often in the mountains and somewhat aloof. They're not asexual, they're not asensual, but they're otherworldly, and they're almost like part human, almost like a young child is sort of angelic and not fully human, but not unhuman. So there's something about that, the virginal goddess motif. You think about the youthful transformation in the 1960s. You think about Pluto and Uranus in the sign of the Virgin. The youth led a very pure-hearted kind of revolution. Some of it is naive. Some of it was puella, meaning it was a little Peter Pan. For example, a lot of people in the 1960s ended up becoming CEOs in the 1980s, right? So I'm not trying to be hard on anybody, but sometimes we idolize the 1960s, and there were a lot of problems in the 60s as well. We idolize the 1960s because we think of them as this great breakthrough in consciousness, but it could be argued that Well, it was a time of cultural, political, historical upheaval and transformation and change, Pluto-Uranus, that there are also problems that arise during that period that are very complicated. Every era is like that. So we always have to make sure we see the light and dark of every historical moment, because ancient astrologers saw history as cyclical, time is cyclical. And so while we have the appearance of everything being very new in the 1960s, very new in the modern era in general, really there's, in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun. Every moment is new. Every day is new. And so the seasons of time have to be understood, without getting overly attached to one thing or another too much, if we're to understand the way that ancient astrologers were thinking. That's an aside. It's not really, I'm not addressing that to you, Kate, if you're listening, or to your question necessarily, but just as an aside. Rick Tarnas wrote a really great book called Cosmos and Psyche. And in that book, he really breaks down the Pluto-Uranus conjunction of the 60s and illustrates the dark and light side of that transit. It's very, very beautiful. So if you want more on that, check out his book, Cosmos and Psyche. Hopefully that covers your question, though. And remembering that the planets aren't causing the 1960s to happen. They are the signs of the times. So in previous times in human history, there have also been great advancements, developments, renaissances. And we've always had different ways of seeing the signs of the time in the planets. There have always been those mundane transits and ways of understanding the season of time that we're in historically have always been there. So I hope that this helps, and I really appreciate your question, Kate. Thank you. Another question was, let's see. From Patricia, she asked, I had talked around Saturday, January 20, maybe it was December 29th or November 29th. Jupiter-Neptune can be all about schemes and big plans or big ideas that we think will bring us success and happiness, but often enough it is exactly our big plans and visions that complicate and weigh us down the most, because the truth is that heaven is found in a mustard seed. Unless we know how to make ourselves small, we rarely see the greatness of the divine. I had written that, and Patricia asked a follow-up question saying, while dreaming big and formulating plans to figure out what my next steps are to gain more self-sufficiency, the overall backbone of survival, so to speak, how does one stay small? So I appreciate this question a lot, because a lot of the times I think we think in terms of these dichotomies that are really false dichotomies. So for example, we think if I stay small, if I stay humble, that means that I can't be ambitious, or that I can't try to succeed at my job, or that I can't develop a plan or a strategy and try to accomplish it in using my gifts in the world or something like that. What I mean by staying small is not about what you're trying to do with your job, or what you're trying to do with a relationship, or what things you're trying to get in the world, right? It's more about the consciousness that we bring into whatever it is that we're doing. So how can we remember how to stay humble and sort of realize that we're in this vast, amazing universe that's so much bigger than we are, and that bigness can give us a kind of comfort that in the grand scheme of things, we're in the shelter of something that's bigger than what we can comprehend, or what we can circumscribe with our mind. And there's a peace that's available to us there. And sometimes we forget that when we're so absorbed in our goals and plans, and big goals and plans, that we think that it's all that there is. And so getting absorbed in that kind of grandiosity about our plans and our life and our job and our manifestation project and our bills and all of this, it's a reality. We're going to have to do it and deal with that stuff regardless. So what I am trying to advocate in what I wrote there about Jupiter-Neptune is about learning to stay small in our heart, in our spirit, not small as in worthless, not small as in that we're not a part of the divine, which is huge and vast, but rather that we try to remain curious, humble, modest, open, receptive, and realizing that we're not always in control of everything, and continue to do whatever it is that we're trying to do our work in the world, make our plans, try to bring our gifts out, have courage to share who we are with the world. I mean, those are all great things. I think it's about the spirit in which we do it. And Jupiter, Neptune can give us big visions, right? But sometimes those big visions and big plans, if they become too grandiose, then the idea that I'm working with here in that post is that we end up forgetting the joy of simple things. So most spiritual traditions or practices teach us about different forms of mindfulness or meditation or prayer. In other words, while we're making our big grand plans and motoring out toward the big horizontal event, whatever that might be or whatever we imagine it to be, there's a lot of little things that we got to do. There's waking up every day, there's brushing our teeth, there's getting the kids ready, there's cleaning up, there's tidying up, there's this new Netflix series out with a woman, Japanese woman named Marie Kondo. I think that's how you say it. And I actually, for Christmas, I bought my wife some sessions with a local Marie Kondo graduate of her program. And it's like this Japanese sort of mindful tidying practice. And she really helps us to return to the joy of simplicity, of the simple things around us and the things in our home. So one of the scenes that she had is this woman in her closet. She had her take everything out of the closet and just dump it on the bed. And then she had to go through every single clothing item that she owned one at a time and really hold it and ask, does this spark joy? And then letting go, saying thank you and letting go of the things that do not spark joy and keeping those that do, and then learning how to really take care of them and how to place them and put them in ways that are organized so that you have more of a relation to the things around you. This is like mindful tidying, right? Thich Nhat Hanh, same thing. Every step, every breath, So what I mean by staying small is not to say be some pathetic, tiny, prostrate yourself before the almighty type of guilt trip or something like that. It's about the smallness of things containing the vastness of things, and that we forget about that when we're wrapped up in my big vision board plans, which I think occupy a lot of us, because even if our plans are awesome and noble, we tend to forget that most of the time when we arrive at the finish line of a big plan, if we haven't changed our consciousness in the small things, the big thing will not deliver the results that we think or hope that they will. So at any rate, that's what I meant by that. Thank you for your question, Patricia, and I hope that this helps. All right, so I think Jack has a question that says, would working at home be a third house topic? I keep getting confused on this one. It could be. Third house is connected as adjacent to the fourth house of home and property. As such, the fourth house also related to life in the city, just everyday life, the common, the village, the common spaces, your home. The third house is adjoined to that space and reflects things that kind of circumambulate around the familiar home base. Planets in the third, for example, are gazing by secondary motion toward the fourth house, but by primary motion, they've been carried out of the fourth house. So there's this dual action of being connected to the roots, but dispersing outward from it. That's why siblings are in the third house, for example. But you also have things like gossip columnists or bloggers or writers, people even like Joan Baez, who's a folk singer that sings about folk things and roots, third house kind of thing. Joan Rivers, third house. I'm a third house sun and third house Mercury. I write and talk and discuss what's happening every day, right? So in a sense, and I work from home, right? The ruler of my fourth is in my third, though. So that kind of shifts things a little bit. Doesn't necessarily mean working at home, but it has a relation. A lot of the times the third house was called goddess. and it was related to pagan or folk or kind of like indigenous religions as well. It's also related to divination. It's kind of it's a house of common everyday things, the bustle and flow of everyday life in the city or around home base or what's familiar. But that can mean a lot of different things. Someone could work at an office as a journalist or a tech person or something like that, but they're dealing with kind of like everyday bustle of information or something like that. And there's a lot of other things we could say about the third house, Jack, but I hope that that helps put you in the right direction. Let's see if I have any others here. Adam Johnson asks, I'm curious if you take a unique approach to sextile or trine aspects that occur outside the bounds of the usual yin-yang or triplicity relationships. For instance, my natal chart shows a Sun-Saturn sextile with the Sun at 29 Scorpio and Saturn at 2 Aquarius. Yes. So he's wondering if out of sign sextiles or trines count. And my answer to that is no. Generally speaking, the first answer is no, they don't. Because in ancient astrology, the first basic premise of an aspect has to do with lines of sight, not between planets, but between signs. So whole signs see one another by virtue of a triangle or a square, which is a polygon within the circle. So it's those aspectual connections between whole signs connected in the polygons of the circle that are facilitating the lines of sight between planets who are in those signs. That's why you have to have an aspectual connection. For an aspectual connection to be made, first and foremost, it has to be by sign. It will never perfect unless it's in the sign, right? So even if it's by degree, a planet in, for example, with yours, you have Sun, Saturn, Sun at 29 Scorpio and Saturn at 2 Aquarius. So, the Sun, when it perfects and enters Sagittarius and hits 2 Sagittarius and makes a sextile to Saturn at 2 Aquarius, that sextile will occur within the appropriate signs. So the aspect is not technically it is what it is only by virtue of being in the appropriate signs. So the question really becomes, what do you do with an application when it's about to cross sign boundaries? Because that is a valid question. An application is not the same as an aspect. An application is 2 planets who are moving to make an aspect. The aspect could already be formed by virtue of the signs, in which case the intensification of the aspect takes place by the perfection of the application between the 2 planets, the faster moving making aspect to the slower moving. And when that faster moving planet makes aspectual connection to the slower moving planet, the idea is that the witnessing that they have of one another by virtue of their signs and houses intensifies, and the language changes in the Greek to scrutinizing. And it becomes a more intense form of the visual ray between the planets. But again, it's made by virtue of the signs. So when the planet crosses the sign boundary and it's applying, if it's separating, forget it, it's not an aspect, right? But if it's applying, meaning it's already passed outside of the boundaries of the sign, the signs, and it's like a fading sextile. Like if it was reversed in this case and the Sun was at 2 Aquarius and Saturn was at 29 Scorpio, then really forget about it, right? Because it's a sign that they've really moved out of their aspectual connection. Even if it appears like they're still close by degree, I really wouldn't think about it that way, that they're in aspect any longer. However, in your case, because the Sun is still applying to Saturn, what I would look at is what happens in terms of the Sun entering Sagittarius, right? Symbolically, in that nativity, in that birth chart, the Sun is symbolically in time, you could say, like a progression or something. But just don't think about it in terms of a literal timing technique. Just think about it as in time, the Sun is going to move into Sagittarius very soon after the birth, right? And then make a sextile. So a dynamic between Sun and Saturn that currently from Scorpio and Aquarius is in a square. They see one another by virtue of a square. Then it's going to become a sextile. I know it sounds counterintuitive because it's like, well, they're so close to making a perfect sextile, but really think about it as the nativity starts off as them seeing one another by virtue of a square. And as the life goes on, very smoothly, they start to harmonize with one another. So for example, maybe in the early part of life, one has a father that's very difficult or sick or ill or something like that, Sun square Saturn. As the life goes on, the father gets better, or the father goes to rehab, or the father becomes a more harmonious figure in one's life. That would be how I would read that transition. But it's very important to read it in a divinatory sense and not just some abstract sense where like, well, technically it's a sextile, so I'll just read that as a sextile. No, the changeover matters, because when it changes the nature of how the planets are currently seeing one another by virtue of the signs, which always comes first. So I hope that helps, Adam. And if you have any other questions, let me know. Some astrologers are going to think a little bit differently about that, especially the farther away you get from the Hellenistic era, because Hellenistic astrologers typically look at the whole sign connection in this way that I'm talking about. Okay, I hope that helps for your question, Adam. There are a few more, but I'm going to end it here, and we'll get to more questions and answers next time we meet. So thank you, everybody. I hope that you enjoy Mercury Mars and have a very beautiful Monday.